Hello, and welcome to MIT Sloan Alumni Online. Every month, MIT Sloan Alumni Online brings you the latest breaking news, cutting-edge research, groundbreaking ideas, and school updates from MIT Sloan faculty and alumni. Today, we are pleased to have Brad Feld joining us. Brad is an early-stage investor and entrepreneur since 1987. Prior to co-founding Foundry Group, he co-founded Mobius Venture Capital, and prior to that, founded Intensity Ventures. He's also a co-founder of Techstars. Brad is a writer and speaker on the topics of venture capital investing and entrepreneurship. He's written a number of books as part of the Startup Revolution series, and he writes the popular blogs Feld Thoughts and Venture Deals. A quick note on format. We will start with a presentation by Brad for about 30 minutes, then follow with a question and answer session. As a reminder to our viewers, you may type in your questions at any time using the Q&A panel in the Zoom interface. Brad, we're glad to have you with us today to share your experiences and to tell us more about the concept of Give First. I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today, and hopefully we'll have some fun with some of the ideas that I've been working on around this notion of Give First, which is linked very directly to two high-level concepts that have been very important to me in my both business career and the companies that I've been involved in, as well as the communities that I've helped build and develop. The first is around the idea of mentorship specifically and effective mentorship. And then the second is what I'm going to put a sort of box around just called business philosophy. And one of the interesting struggles in general with business is, I think back, I'm 52 now, so I think of the last 30 years or so that I've been starting, building, and investing in companies, is that there are regular shifts in the way that people think about what productive activity in business is. When I was in business school in late 1980s, the ideas around it felt very different to me than a lot of the ideas around effective business today. So I try to present this as a looking forward, using some things in this construct of Give First that have been effective for me, but at the same time developing a broader concept or business philosophy going forward. You can see my email, brad@feld.com. I welcome emails from anyone. Try to respond to everything that I get. So feel free to drop me a note at any time after this call or anytime in the future if I can be helpful to you specifically on your own journey or you want to explore anything that we've talked about today. All right, so I'm going to start by defining Give First. And since this is a business school an alumni presentation, it'll be heavy text and light on graphics, which I think is certainly the style from 1988. But every time I see something in an academic context, it's that. Now, I know everybody can read, but I wanted to put the language around this very specifically because it's important, and there's a couple of different parts of it. So Give First as a construct is defined very specifically as a person being willing to enter into relationships non-transactionally. And I want to emphasize that phrase. You're willing to put energy into a system, but you don't expect anything back. However, it's not altruistic. And this is a little bit of the contradiction in the idea right now, which is that you do expect to get something back at some point. You just don't know when, in what amount, from whom, in what form, or over what time frame. So, there's a little bit of parallelism there between the notion of putting energy into a system without expecting anything back. But then over time, you're going to get things back. You just don't know what it is that you're going to get back. In the context of communities, as well as in the context of mentorship, and I'll go deeper on that in a bit, if you can get a lot of people acting with a Give First approach in a system, what happens is you get this very powerful input into the system that generates a lot of activity and energy. And over time, usually pretty quickly, lots of stuff starts coming out of the system that benefits all the people that are involved. So that's the very high level concept. This appeared for the first time in a book I wrote in 2012 called Startup Communities. And the premise for that book was that you could build a startup community anywhere in the world that has at least 100,000 people. In 2012, the phrase startup communities had never been used before. People talked about these as entrepreneurial ecosystems or research clusters. And there's a lot of discussion about if you want to start a high-tech company, you need to be in the Bay Area or you need to be on the coasts. And with startup communities, I made this assertion that you could build startup communities anywhere in the world as long as you had a city of at least 100,000 people. In fact, cities had to have a startup community for long-term health and innovation and vibrancy around the city. And sort of buried in the book, not as one of the overarching principles, but one of the ideas that was critical, was that people that are participating in the startup community have what I called then a give before you get attitude and approach, which kind of was some version of these words, which then evolved into this notion of specifically of give first. I want to spend a minute or so just talking about why I care and why I think others should care. And put these 5 bullet points in a very general sense, and I'll go a little bit deeper on each one of them as we go through them. So the first is the experience that I've had in my 30 years of being in business that gets us to where we are today, which is that I strongly believe that networks are now more important than hierarchies. Hierarchy as a structure is still relevant in the context of our society. When I was in business school in the late 1980s, networks were never talked about. And every now and then there'd be something around network theory, but it was very abstract and sort of very distant from the core way to run an industrial business or even a technology-based business. And if you study hierarchies and you think about it, hierarchies were essentially created as a way of organizing labor. And the hierarchies that we have in society go back, millennia, and all government, all religion are different forms of hierarchy or hierarchies. If you look at business, hierarchies really evolved from the Industrial Revolution and probably became codified as management theory in the 1920s, 1930s, linked back to Sloan, Alfred Sloan, and the notion of how to run an organization that's as scaled as GM. Interestingly, if you think about how we've all been programmed in the last 15 or so years, and when I say programmed by computers who are helping us learn how to interact with each other. I have another thesis, which is that the robots have already taken over, or the machines have already taken over. They're just very patient. They let us put all the data into them and they let us do all the work while they sort of sit around and collect all the information patiently waiting their time. But if you think about the communication dynamics, the idea of networks and specifically social networks really emerged in the last 15 years. And communication, which followed a network approach across organizations with things like email, which went back much further than that, really became wired into the fabric of business around the turn of the century. In the 2007, 2008, 2009 timeframe, with the financial crisis, I would assert very strongly that the importance of networks, that was the moment in time where the importance of networks increased over the importance of hierarchies. We had a premonition that hierarchies were the sort of sustainable bedrock of our society around how it's organized. And in this 2 to 3 year period of financial crisis, there were enormous challenges around the notion of hierarchies. And the long-lasting effects of communication, of commerce, of the way people interacted with each other, and as a way organizations reformed on the back of the financial crisis, really was a function much more of networks than the reorganization of the hierarchies. I spent an entire hour talking about this. There's a lot of debate around this, especially around technology circles today. But if you think about things like AI and machine learning, an enormous amount of the power of contemporary technology around that, machine learning, by the way, when I was at MIT was called expert systems. So, the general concepts of expert systems and neural networks have been around for a long time. Notice the word networks in neural networks. And so this idea that the machines now and the network of everything that we're connected to is essential to how we operate has increased in importance. And I think it's unslowable. Hierarchies will still exist, but they won't be anywhere as important as networks going forward. Second, if you think about historical business philosophies and you think about entrepreneurship today, I would assert that the historical business philosophies are disconnected from entrepreneurship today. I started my first company in 1987. All of the information about starting a company in 1987 was opaque. The business heroes were people like Lee Iacocca, who were referred to as, quote, entrepreneurs, even though you couldn't relate to them in any way, shape, or form. Now, there were entrepreneurs that were contemporaries of mine in the 1980s, but there wasn't really a network that connected them together in a particularly effective way. And again, this opacity of information was front and center. Today, the amount of information about entrepreneurship, about starting companies, the ability to interact across entrepreneurial networks, across individual companies, and reach, the essential entrepreneurs from any place outside those organizations has shifted very dramatically in favor of, again, this network world. So if you think about how people that are generationally in their 20s today are thinking about entrepreneurship, in a lot of ways, it's very different than me in my 50s was exposed to it at that age. And that leads to the next point, which is I believe we have a very significant generational shift going on in our society. I think it's global. It's particularly pronounced in the US. And I think there's other countries which I'm not as familiar with, but you can see those generational shifts going on from afar as well. And this generational shift is one where the approach and attitude towards what's important, both about life and business and society, are once again evolving or changing in the same way that, with every generation, the baby boomers had an evolution. I'm part of Generation X, as is codified, had a generational shift. I think the generational shift that's going on right now is particularly perplexing because it's against the backdrop of the conflict between globalism and nationalism, which has been front and center in our country the last couple of years. This is really important because I think at these moments in time, you can start to have movements and new philosophies around things start to take root. Next, communities have become demonstrably powerful. When I was starting off my first company, I didn't know who my peers were. I had no way to find them. I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know how to think about them. And I really struggled sort of with this concept of what should I be doing and who should I be talking to and how should I think about that? I got lucky. I ended up about 4 years into my first company finding an organization called Young Entrepreneurs Organization that's now called Entrepreneurs Organization. It's a cousin to Young Presidents Organization. Some of you may know one or the other organizations. And it was literally the first time that I found my peer group. That had an immense impact on me as an entrepreneur. And when I wind forward to today, and I think about not just peer groups like those, but also very, very large communities like what we've created in Techstars. If you're not familiar with Techstars, today it's a very sizable actual operating business. It's got about 250 employees, growing very quickly and very profitably. But at the same time, we now have 40 accelerator programs with 10 companies in each program that happen each year somewhere around the globe. So that's 400 companies, about, let's say, 1,000 entrepreneurs or so that get funded by Techstars. There's a program called Startup Weekend, which about 100,000 aspiring entrepreneurs participate in, about 1,000 events all over the world. And then there's another program called Startup Week that happens about twice a week somewhere in the world that is a celebration of entrepreneurship within a city, sort of building on that notion of startup community. So within entrepreneurship, communities have become demonstrably powerful. But if you think about the phenomena of social networking, even online, separated and disconnected from business, there's this huge impact that you have when you get a large group of people communicating in a network model around a particular set of ideas. Last comment I'll make here, which I alluded to earlier with my YEO experience, is that mentorship can be magical. And I use the word magical a couple of times in this presentation because I think it really is a word that's underused in business. A magical moment from a product perspective is the one that many people who build products are looking for, right? You want your customer or your user to have a magical moment early in their usage of your product where they say, wow, I must have this product, I must use it. And an example from my world, if you go to my blog at feld.com, I wrote about an email client called Superhuman a couple of days ago. And I was very skeptical that I paid $29 a month for an email client. I've been a Gmail and Chrome user for many years, and I process a lot of email each day. And I had a magical moment with Superhuman, literally within about the first 2 minutes. And I'm like, whoa, there's something here. The same thing happens in your communication around mentorship. And it's especially true with peer mentorship, both when you are interacting with a peer or when a mentor-mentee relationship evens out and becomes a peer mentorship where both the mentor and the mentee are learning as much from each other over time. And so the notion of give first and sort of this approach to business is an elemental component of that. All right, I want to talk briefly, and I'll go through this very quickly, but just sort of a timeline about my journey to give first. It touches on a handful of things that I've done. I hope most of you know Eric von Hippel and Eric's research. Eric was my doctoral advisor and my master's advisor. Is still a mentor of mine and somebody I look to closely, both personally and intellectually. And in 1978, he said something that's influenced my entire investment thesis as an investor and my view in terms of my own work, which is the idea that innovation comes from users. That was a heretical statement at the time because everybody believed that manufacturers and people who were building product knew what the users want. There's still, plenty of cliches that float around, like the famous Steve Jobs quote of, users don't know what they want, I know what they want. But fundamentally, if you look at the evolution and creation of many great products and companies, the user is at the essential core of that. I was at MIT from 83 to 90. I started my first company in 1987. I dropped out of the PhD program in 1990, but I did spend a good chunk of time, probably 3 or 4 years, hanging around Eric and hanging around with other people in the group that he was part of, thinking about sources of innovation and the dynamics of how innovation occurs and grows. In 1993, I sold that company to a public company called Ameridata, and I met the most influential mentor that I've had in business, a guy named Len Fassler. And what happened with that relationship was Len, who was probably about my age when we met, maybe a little older, mid-50s, late 50s, he really had no need to engage with me as a mentor. He liked me, he was willing to invest in me, I liked him. And over many years and over a number of different activities, we've had incredible experiences where I've been able to watch his own philosophy around business, and he's in his late 80s today. And when you look at the number of people that have been connected to Len over his 60 plus year business career, it's remarkable how broad that network is because of the way that he behaved with regard to all of those people in what I would describe as a give first way. I took most of the money that I made from selling my first company and made a bunch of angel investments at the beginning of the commercial internet. I then ended up helping co-found and lead a venture fund that was a spinoff from SoftBank called Mobius that was very successful short-term from 1996 to say 2000, and then crashed very hard in 2001, 2002 with the internet bubble. But I learned an enormous amount from that, both positive and negative, about many of the things that inform the way that I make investments today. I started writing very actively in 2004, very openly in this effort to eliminate this opacity around venture deals. And if any of you have ever read the book Venture Deals, when it came out in 2010 or 11 or whenever we published it, it was the first time that somebody had really written in what was basically English, an understanding of how not just term sheets worked, but how early stage investments worked. And if you think about that, that was only 8 years ago. We were still in a place in 2010 where entrepreneurship was starting to emerge again. I mean, 2007, 2008, it was really flat on its back. And the idea of what had come out of the the internet bubble in 2000, or the crash of the internet bubble, 2001 to 2004. Even by 2007, 2008, the financial crisis in a lot of ways overshadowed that, even though there's some amazing companies created in the 2004 to 2008 timeframe. And even by 2010, this idea of global entrepreneurship was still a niche idea, was still a counterculture idea, for lack of a better phrase. I moved to Boulder in 1995. I got to Boulder from Boston because my wife, Amy, who grew up in Alaska and went to Wellesley, told me she was moving to Boulder and I could come with her, so I did. I knew one person, he moved away 6 months later, but we decided to make Boulder our home. And about a decade later, I co-founded Techstars with 3 other people. And we were the first mentor-driven accelerator, the second accelerator to be created. But we really pioneered this notion of, in addition to having the accelerator type activity, really surrounding the entrepreneurs in that local geography with a very active set of mentors, usually somewhere between 50 and 100 over the course of a 3-year program. 2007, again, beginning of the financial crisis, and at a point where entrepreneurship certainly wasn't trendy, I started Foundry Group, which is the primary place where I spend my time. And much of what we've tried to do with Foundry Group is from Boulder, Colorado, with a small partnership, a team of 6 of us, a very small organization. The entire organization's only 14 people. We have no associates, no junior people, no EIRs. It's just us. We built a very large early stage VC footprint all across the US, both through our direct investments, through our activity in Techstars and investments in Techstars, and then our investments in about 30 partner funds, where about 30% of our capital is invested in other early stage venture funds. So using this network model to really build and develop what is now a sizable venture fund. We manage about $2.5 billion and have about 100 active portfolio companies and about 30 active funds. You can see the last couple of things sort of in this timeline as we wander up to Give First with what I talked about earlier with startup communities. I mentioned the Startup Weekend, Startup Week activities. So you can see sort of this acceleration of this idea. And in 2016, Techstars adopted the hashtag Give First as its mantra. So they took the give before you get notion and started to amplify this philosophy across the entire Techstars network with great effect to this day. So pausing for a second and talking about Give First current status, it's become the underlying mantra and philosophy of Techstars. It's also been the evolution of the Techstars Mentor Manifesto. And I'm gonna wander through the Techstars Mentor Manifesto quickly at the tail end of this to give you a feeling for how Techstars thinks about mentorship. And essentially, if you get nothing else out of this discussion, some ideas specifically about mentorship. Boulder has developed a startup community that is known around the world. Hopefully some of you know of Boulder as a startup community. You know, when I moved to Boulder, it was a hippie town with some tech in it. And while weed wasn't legal yet, there was plenty of that around. And it was about 100,000 people. Today, it's about 100,000 people. But the business infrastructure of the city is dominated and influenced by the startup community and by the growth and development of startups and tech companies. This idea of Give First is starting to become talked about publicly. We just had a conference last week at CU Boulder at something called Silicon Flatirons. There are people starting to engage in it in the same way that people started to engage around the idea of startup communities in 2010, 2011. So if any of this rings true to you, I invite you to reach out to me, because I'm really starting to take the ideas from a high level and codify it in a more significant way. I love getting challenged by people who are struggling with the notion or disagree with it, because it's very vague still. We're at the beginning of the development of this essentially qualitative approach. I'm not going to try to do research around it. I'm not going to try to justify it from a quantitative perspective, but in a systems way, try to describe qualitatively phenomena. And in the same way that it culminated and really began a movement around startup communities, the book Startup Communities, when it came out, was not the beginning of the idea, but was the beginning of codifying a movement that over the next 3 or 4 years had global impact. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that we can do the same thing around the idea of Give First. So I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes or so of the starting point of this call before we do Q&A talking about the Techstars Mentor Manifesto. And if nothing else, you're going to get 18 magic tricks to being a great mentor. Now, the reason I say 18 is because there's 18 elements in the Techstars Mentor Manifesto. And the interesting thing about it is 18 is way too many in a manifesto, or essentially in any sort of principle. For example, in startup communities, I have something called the Boulder Thesis, which are the principles for building a vibrant startup community, and there's 4 of them. 18 is a lot, but I think what you'll see is, as you roll through this, is that a bunch of them are linked to each other, and there's an element of cumulativeness of it that's very powerful. The goal is not to like carry around a list with the 18 that you have to do, but as a mentor, continue to reflect on the engagement with mentees and vice versa. And if you're someone who is being mentored by other people, sort of carrying around some of these ideas in your mind, and especially interacting with your mentor around the notion of developing a relationship where you become peer mentors, is incredibly powerful. So let's blast through them pretty quickly. The first one is simple. It's be Socratic. The essence of being a great mentor is to ask a lot of questions. Now, if all you do is ask questions, you'll be a lousy mentor. But you have to start from the frame of reference of understanding what the person you're being a mentor to is doing, is struggling with, is understanding or not understanding, and the best way to get there is to be Socratic. The second is that you have to expect nothing in return. There's a lot of situations where people define themselves or present themselves as a mentor, but they start the relationship by asking for something transactionally. I'll be a mentor if, And it could be financial, it could be time, it could be some kind of commitment. And my own experience over many, many relationships is that if as a mentor you engage in the relationship expecting nothing in return, amazing things can happen. And in some cases, the relationship doesn't go anywhere. And for a lot of people, that's just fine. Next is to be authentic. And in Techstars language, we say practice what you preach. It's amazing the number of people who are in a mentor role who tell people something and then do something else. And think about that in your normal life. And we see it everywhere, sort of in the media and the news. With mentorship, it's the best way to undermine your credibility right away is to not be authentic with your mentees. Number 4 is be direct and tell the truth, however hard. We have a phrase within Foundry Group, which we use for how my partners and I communicate with each other, which is brutal honesty delivered kindly. We argue a lot, we debate a lot, we differ on a lot of things, but we deliver all of our interactions directly, and we do it kindly. Building your own style around this is important, and developing a reputation for your style as a mentor is important. But if you're not direct, and if you don't focus on telling the truth, recognizing that a lot of times your truth may not be correct, you will essentially not be doing the best service you can for your mentees. We like to remind people to listen. The age-old cliche of everybody has two ears and one mouth is a useful one here, although I realize I'm talking at you for 30 minutes straight, so there you go. Whoops. The best mentor relationships eventually become 2 ways. We've really talked about that already, and that's the notion of the mentee becoming as effective a mentor as the mentor is to the mentee. And I'll use Len Fassler as an example. If you ask Len, hey, do you think you've taught Brad more or learned more from Brad? He'd say yes, which is that he's learned a lot from me and he's taught me a lot, and vice versa. Next is to be responsive. Interestingly, your mentees may not be responsive, but as a mentor, holding this value of being responsive is really important. Your mentee has all kinds of different issues and challenges, and one of the big struggles for a mentee is when they're in a relationship with somebody that they view as a mentor, and that mentor is not responsive to them. In Techstars, we like to tell mentors that if you want to be active, you have to adopt at least one company every single year. So you have to always be mentoring. It's not something where you can kind of do it a little bit and then stop. The next is this idea of separating opinion from fact. Remember, I said it earlier, your truth may not be the truth. And your opinion may not be fact. And so being really clear when you're asserting a hypothesis, or you have an opinion, or you believe something is factually true, delivering the information with those kinds of tags on it to your mentee is key. Hold information in confidence. This may be obvious, but there's an enormous amount of information trading, especially around entrepreneurship and investing. And if you're going to be a mentor, the second you become an information trader, you're no longer an effective mentor. So recognize that you're getting this very valuable set of stuff from the mentee, which is information, and respecting what is confidential is critical. Make a commitment or don't. Halfway doesn't work. If you're going to be a mentor, be all in. If you have a mentor and you're a mentee, be all in. You know, cliche-ishly, you get what you put into it. But the problem is when you're a fence sitter in this scenario, you really do yourself a disservice and you do your mentee a disservice. Know what you don't know. Many people in a position where they're mentors or where they're even, you know, a position of power are very uncomfortable saying the 3 words, I don't know. Those 3 words in a lot of ways are incredibly powerful, especially in entrepreneurship, because the result of saying those 3 words puts you in a place where you can actually then go deeper on the specific thing on a quest for understanding what's going on versus dismissing it with something that's either wrong or sends somebody down the wrong path. This one I like a lot, guide, don't control. And the reason for it is that so many people, especially in one-up relationships, try to control the situation. Many mentors are entrepreneurs who are used to being in a situation of control. When you're a mentor, you don't want to control what the action of your mentee is. You want to be a guide. I like to say as a mentor, I'm being a great mentor if I work for the mentee rather than trying to control where the mentee goes. Mentor-to-mentor communication across a community is really valuable. A lot of mentors sort of view their worlds sort of one-dimensionally. Okay, I've got a mentee and I'm going to go be a mentor to this mentee and that's my responsibility. In fact, if you can engage in the network of other mentors, the amount that you can learn and the amplification of that learning for you as a mentor, both around mentorship, but also around many other topics that you're touching on, is super powerful. Attitude matters a lot, and there's certainly moments in time when you should be pessimistic or negative about what's going on, but try to start from an optimistic posture. The person you're being a mentor to has whatever their stresses are, and everybody on the planet has their own stresses. But when you engage in a mentoring relationship, coming at it from a posture of optimism and sort of linked to this idea of authenticity from earlier can be very powerful. Last couple. Focus on providing specific actionable advice. If you've asked questions, if you've listened, if you've been clear about what's a fact versus what's an opinion, at some point you start synthesizing all of this from your experience, and giving specific actionable advice is very powerful. It's useful also not to assume that your advice is going to be followed. A good mentee will tell you when she doesn't follow your advice. Hey, Brad, thanks for giving me the following advice. I decided not to do it for the following reasons. That creates a loop where the mentor can actually learn. And so as a mentor, if you see a mentee not following your advice, don't be upset by it, but say, hey, I see you doing something other than what we talked about. You must have learned something that didn't occur to me. Clue me in so I can learn from that. Be challenging and robust, but never destructive. A little bit of the same thing that we talked about with an optimistic posture. It's very easy in a one-up relationship, especially when you're under pressure or you feel stress, to use a destructive attitude, especially when somebody's not succeeding or struggling. Again, if you turn it around, you want to challenge the person, but you want to lift them up. You want to elevate them versus tearing them down. And I'll end with have empathy, because startups are really hard. And we tell this to Techstars mentors over and over again. Many of them are entrepreneurs. They know that startups are really hard, but often in the heat of being a mentor, you forget and you start pushing the mentee in a way that isn't challenging, and having a layer of empathy in there is a key part. So hopefully from this sort of movement through these 18 points, if nothing else, you got a couple of gems to think about. And hopefully the overall notion of give first and the idea of mentorship and this evolution of a new way to think about communities and interacting with each other is something that captivates you a little. And if it does, again, I'd love to hear from you and engage around it. I'll end with my email address, which I told you about earlier, but again, send me an email anytime. If this topic's interesting, there's a couple of other things you can do. One is you can write and talk publicly about it. I am using this idea it's not an idea that I'm trying to do anything other than develop and expand and build on as part of a broader movement and a broader set of thinking around this. I don't have a monetization strategy for it. I don't have a consulting firm that I'm building for it. So I view it as something that's part of the commons, and I'd rather it be something that anybody that's interested in takes and involves it. Separate from Give First, if you're already in some peer groups at Sloan and at MIT, I'm sure, and your peer group of your fellow students, as well as if you're alums is very powerful peer groups. Go find other ones. For me, finding my peer groups in lots of different dimensions and continuing to search for them over the last 30 years and find new ones has been one of the most rewarding parts of my own career. And the last is, rather than absorbing somebody else's philosophy, start developing your own philosophy of business. And I say this very deliberately. It's a lot of fun to explore whether you're in an organization or running an organization or creating an organization anew, your own individual view of how things can work, do work, and should work from your frame of reference. And if you're part of an existing organization, I would tell you the best organizations embrace that, and the worst organizations are terrified of it. So depending on where the organization you're part of is on that spectrum, it should give you a good sense of whether or not you're in a place, if you have no interest in this, the organization that's terrified of people that work in their organization developing their own frames of reference for how it should work, probably totally fine. But if this stings to you and you find yourself in that kind of an organization, you might be in the wrong kind of organization. So allow it to be something that you play around with and explore over time.
Great, thanks, Brad. As a reminder to our viewers, you may type your questions for Brad into the Q&A panel. And while you're doing that, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about a few upcoming MIT Sloan Alumni Online events. On November 15th, we'll hear from faculty member Tavneet Suri, who is the Louis E. Saley Professor of Applied Economics. Her expertise is in development economics with a specialization in sub-Saharan Africa. Also on December 4th, we will hear from Bryn Penne Burkhart, who is the Senior Associate Director of Alumni Career Services here at MIT Sloan. She will continue her popular Career Conversations series from last spring. We're looking forward to having both of them join us this fall. You can learn more about these sessions and register by visiting the MIT Sloan Alumni Online website. And now we'll get to some questions for Brad. So the first one, Brad, you mentioned finding your peer group. So one of the questions that came in is, how do you identify other give firsters so that you're really building a healthy community?
So I don't have a precise answer on how to identify others. I think it's more leading with the philosophy amongst your peers. So it's modeling behavior where you're willing to put energy into others continually. And it's not that you are reminding them, hey, I'm giving first, hey, I'm giving first, hey, look how good I am, hey, look at what I'm doing. It's much more about your style and your approach, especially if you're viewed in that community as one of the leaders. What I've found is that people follow the behavior that's modeled both within communities and within organizations. Organizations are harder to evolve that behavior because of the hierarchical nature of so many organizations and the way that cultural norms develop and evolve. In a community, they're much more fluid. And so with peer groups or any other type of network model, modeling that behavior will start to generate positive feedback and positive attraction from others, presuming that it's behavior and it's a frame of reference that community is responsive to. Last comment on this is one of the things that I purposely haven't done in the long period of time that I've now been in Boulder is focus on any sort of quantitative metrics around it. And I mentioned this earlier, but I think this is a particularly important thing, is that keeping score is really antithetical in some ways to the development of a network and development of a community. And keeping score of whether someone is, quote, give first or not, it's counterproductive. What's better is to behave that way, and then more people will emulate or support that behavior when they see it and they start to see the activity around it. It's not to say that you shouldn't talk about it conceptually as a behavioral norm, but that sort of keeping track of who's doing what is very difficult and counterproductive.
Thanks, Brad. And I love that point because here at MIT, of course, we love data. So it's definitely well noted.
Yeah, I spent 7 years there and I spent a lot of time with data. And yeah, data informs a lot of stuff in my world. One of the things I like to say is that you can be a great venture capital investor without ever having to open a spreadsheet except to read things that people send you in spreadsheets. And that's important because building non-quantitative instincts around a lot of things is very important. And this would be another place where like developing that qualitative muscle really pays off.
Great, thank you. So how do you think about mentoring opportunities for individuals who are from diverse backgrounds, who maybe aren't well connected currently? Where do they start?
So whether it's diverse backgrounds or mentoring people as a mentor, whether you come from a diverse background or a mentee, one of the things that's very powerful in 2018 is the conversation around diversity and inclusion has, at least in my circles, with entrepreneurship and in technology and venture capital, is a front and center conversation where, 15, 20 years ago, I don't think it was even a meaningful topic. And certainly in the 80s when I was in business school, it wasn't a focal point of the discussion. So I think for starters, there's a good understanding of the value of engaging people from diverse backgrounds, and whatever those dimensions are that you're measuring on. I'll be careful not to fall into what's become a cliche-ish dog whistle, which is diversity of thought, which I think for a lot of people undermines the notion of ethnicity or gender diversity. But I would suggest that in the context of both businesses and communities and mentorship, you are trying to get different frames of reference into the mix. So don't lose sight of the fact that people from diverse backgrounds tend to have diverse frames of reference. And that's very, very helpful. The specific question was, how do I find people either, I'll go both ways, either to mentor or who can mentor me? And what I'd say is if you're looking for mentors, in a lot of ways, the best way to do that is to show up in the community. You'll be surprised, especially around entrepreneurship, the number of people who are willing to sort of by default give first and engage in, without really knowing the construct, and engage in this mentor type relationship for whatever reason. And the better and more active of those people are actually looking to mentor people they're going to learn from. And diversity is a dimension where somebody can really learn from. The flip side of it is equivalently true. And I would again say, show up. If you're someone who wants to provide mentorship, and a lot of people say, well, I'm just starting out in my career and I have nothing to tell anybody or teach anybody, that's just false. At the beginning of your career, you are learning an enormous amount of things. And there's a bunch of people that are probably, again, thinking about peer mentors, or even people who are outside the industry that you have deep domain expertise in, but at the same time want to learn more, get connected into it. So my suggestion is to use the notion and the idea of diversity as a way to be a powerful way for somebody else to understand a different perspective based on your own experiences and perspective.
Thank you. So in your presentation, you mentioned the 18 magic tricks for mentors, and that's really helpful. I know we have a lot of folks who are asking if they can have the slides after this session so they can review those. But you know, thinking about mentors, and certainly a lot of positives that they can bring, but where have you seen some pitfalls with mentors, or kind of where have you seen mentors being a constraint to entrepreneurship?
Yep. So a couple quick suggestion at the beginning. If you want to, the slides are fine to distribute to whoever want them, but at the same time, if you go to feld.com and literally just type Techstars Mentor Manifesto, there's a post that'll come up in the search that's these 18 things. But then I've written blog posts on many of them with stories, initial ideas that'll get woven into the book that, or been woven into the book that I'm working on. So there's a lot of content already on feld.com that fleshes this out, which is very much the same way that I wrote the Startup Communities book and Venture Deals, where I blog, not daily, but sort of periodically about different aspects of it. So if it's interesting, search for that. Here's some very quick hit things that cause mentors either to be ineffective or create problems. The first is the mentor doesn't realize that they're not the one that's controlling the mentee. You find these situations where a mentor struggles to understand how to lift up or support the mentee, and instead tries to get the mentee to go down a path that the mentor thinks is the best one. So that's like the biggest sort of quick fail. The next is that the mentor isn't intellectually curious. The best mentors are learning as much from the mentee as the mentee is learning from the mentor. And if you're a mentor and you're not being intellectually curious, you're missing out on at least 50% of the experience, and your mentee is not going to be able to engage with you sort of next level down in a significant way. A lot of the stuff sort of sprinkled through it, I'd simply say I'd call bad behavior, right? This idea of being non-responsive, this idea of being controlling, this idea of, you know, this is the answer, this is the way you should do it, being directive, not listening. These are things that then cause, in a lot of ways, oftentimes a mentor-mentee relationship not to work, but more specifically, alienates a mentee from the mentor. If I'm a mentee and you're telling me what to do and I don't agree with you, but I don't know how to argue with you, and I don't have room and space to challenge you, I'm going to withdraw, and that relationship's not going to develop. And then the last is this sort of rush to transactional dynamics. And I see it amazingly too often. There's lots of transactional dynamics in our world, especially in business. And, you know, I have people every now and then say, I love your give first philosophy. Why don't you give me $5 million for my company? And when I'm successful, I'll decide what to give you back. And, you know, that's not how contracts work, and that's not how investments work. And you can have a give first philosophy that's a superset of that, but you do reduce things to transactions in terms of relationships at different points of time. Mentors who rush to the transactional relationship undermine the whole construct of the mentor-mentee dynamic. And there's a really interesting thing that can happen, especially on the heels of a transactional relationship, where you can start to then develop a mentor-mentee relationship that's independent of that. And my relationship with Len Fassler would be a good example of it. His company did buy my company, and so there was a transactional relationship at the beginning, but very, very quickly, within a matter of months of the deal closing, I would say our relationship had shifted from a transactional one and from a boss to somebody who was reporting to him, to a situation where he was clearly teaching me, I was learning from him, and I was also teaching him.
Great, thanks. So we have a viewer submitted question that has been a reader of your blog, so at Feld Thoughts. And so they noted that you emphasize at times the power of no on your blog. So how do you one, prioritize the causes that you give your time to now, but maybe even tying it back to Give First. How does Give First influence how you say no?
Yeah, so I say no to things 50 to 100 times a day. And my most difficult meal of the day is dinner. For 25 years, I'm a marathon runner, and I weigh about somewhere between 10 and 20 pounds more than I want to at any given time. And I've struggled to lose that weight. And the reason is, at the end of the day, I've said no so many times that I have absolutely decision fatigue. I have zero energy left to say no. And so I make crummy choices at dinner if I have to make dinner. So just sort of as a sense of the magnitude of it, I think most people in a lot of roles have different elements of decision fatigue, especially if you're in a role where you have to say no a lot. However, there's liberation from saying no a lot and understanding how to say no. Because what you start to do, or what I've done over time, is I've had to learn how to calibrate my own ability and energy around things, and say no to things that drain too much energy from me, and say yes to things that fill up my tank. Everybody's different on these dimensions. And for me, I'll give an example of this. I had lunch today with a CEO of a company we're investors in. I'm not on the board, but it's a friend of mine. And we sat for an hour and had a wonderful lunch. I hadn't had lunch with him in a while. And that hour of time with him filled up my tank a lot. And it filled up my tank probably the equivalent of spending a month interacting with people on Twitter. And what I've learned over time is that interacting with people on Twitter just drains me. It's not satisfying. It's not enjoyable. So sort of starting to segment your life, whether it's, again, in the context of mentorship or just the work you're doing, where you can separate between what fills you up and what drains you, and making sure you have the right mix of those two. Because if you have too much that's draining you, you'll break. And if you're doing nothing that's draining you, you're probably not stretching yourself very much. Last comment I'd make on this, which I have found really fascinating as time has passed, is this whole notion of a to-do list and a not-do list. And there's a number of people that this idea is attributed to. And the one that amuses me the most is Warren Buffett, because he's come out and said publicly, nope, I never said that. People just made that up. But it's the idea of making, taking whatever your current to-do list is and just making an exhaustive to-do list, 25, 30, 50 things, whatever it is. And then of that list, you get to choose 5 of them. And everything else goes on another list called the not to-do list. And you can't put something on the to-do list unless you finish it, or you decide you're not going to do it anymore. And then you can deliberately choose one thing, not the top thing, but one thing from the not to-do list. You don't have to use that methodology, but whatever it is, regularly pruning the noise from your world so that you can focus the majority of your energy on things that matter to you is really the only way to make substantive progress on things over a long period of time.
Thanks, Brad. We're coming to the end of the hour, so we have time for one more question to close us out. But you've been very generous with your time with us today, so we really appreciate that, and really appreciate your thoughts on community building and mentoring. We think about this all the time from alumni relations at Sloan, but it's a really gratifying thing to see that across the alumni network even, Sloanies are very willing to give to each other. So thank you for your part in that as well. So last question to close us out. What is really exciting to you about the work that you're doing right now, and what's next?
Well, I'm in a phase in my own work arc where I am very happy with the structures around me. I derive immense pleasure from the relationship I have with my partners at Foundry Group. I feel very proud of the work we do with the companies we're investors in, both the successes and the failures. I feel like the learning that we do, the kinds of impacts that we can have, the relationships that we develop with entrepreneurs over multiple companies is very powerful. And then as I watch Techstars continue to grow, I feel, I'm going to use the word pride again, immense pride at what that organization is accomplishing and what it can accomplish, at least aspirationally, over the next decade. So my view is that in my 50s, I'm going to continue to put a lot of energy into these things that I'm doing today and the role that I'm playing, which is a combination of investor, mentor, supporter. We have a line that we like to use at Foundry Group, which is, as long as we support the CEO in a company, we work for her. And if we don't wake up one day and don't support her anymore, it's our job to do something about it, which does not mean fire her. It means actually work to actively get back to a place where we support her. And I really like that role of supporting. And then the role of leading more around intellectual constructs, some that take life, like startup communities, and hopefully give first, and plenty of others that I played around with over the years that disappeared because they were either, as I developed ideas, they weren't interesting anymore, or became unformed, or just didn't go anywhere. And so sort of for the next decade, my view is that that's the zone I'm in. In terms of the actual substance of that, I said this earlier, I believe that machines have taken over. I think that as a species, we do not understand at all what 50 years from now is going to look like. And I find that utterly and completely fascinating. 50 years from now, I'll be 102. I have no idea if I'll be alive or not. I think it'd be pretty cool if I was, but statistically, as of today, it's unlikely. But the idea that the amount of change that we're going to have across our species and our society in the next 50 years, I think is incredibly dramatic. And I love the idea of being able to play with it at both a human level and a technological level.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. We appreciate your time today and, of course, sharing your thoughts on Give First. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. And again, if anybody wants to engage at any level about anything, it doesn't have to be Give First. As a fellow Sloanie, just email me at brad@feld.com anytime.
Thanks, Brad. I want to thank all of our Sloan alumni and friends for joining us. To keep this conversation going over social media, you can use the hashtag SloanieChat and probably hashtag GiveFirst. Following this event, you'll receive a survey as well as a link to the recording. So please fill that out and let us know your feedback on the session, as well as our ongoing lineup of events this fall. As always, you can reach out to us at sloanalumnionline@mit.edu. Thanks again for joining us today, and thanks again to Brad.